Since the fall of man, a war has raged between good and evil. Over the centuries, this war has distorted the truth. Now the truth is perceived as lies, and lies acknowledged as truth. To this day, the battle continues as we investigate and debate the truth behind the history and mystery of the universe. We are Paratruth Radio. Dragons have lived within mythological stories for centuries. They have appeared in India, Europe, and the Americas. But the most commonly related version of the dragon exists within the pages of the Holy Bible. The only question that lingers regarding these enormous beasts is whether the stories are true, figurative, or simply a creature made up by one's mind for the simple pleasure of entertainment.
Now Paratruth presents The Lore of the Dragon.
How's it going, Para fans? Welcome to another episode of Paratruth Radio. My name is Justin.
And I'm Eric.
And we are here once again on PTRN, Paratruth Radio Network. How you doing today there, my good co-host?
I am doing just fine and dandy. Been a interesting week thus far. Looking forward to next week.
Well, as we got started here, Eric has got his composer ready to roll for his movie, so it is quickly approaching. It's kind of amazing to see that it is already approaching.
Only a couple months out.
Yeah. So
it's coming together.
Good. All right. So tonight, folks, we have a very interesting topic for you guys. Tonight, we are going to be discussing dragons. One of my all-time favorite creatures, mythological creatures. Eric knows this, of course. But just to get into it, dragons have been around for as long as there has been written history. There's different characters who have fought the dragons. Michael is one. The Archangel Michael is one that is described as fighting the dragon, which is Satan. The Saint George is another character that fights a dragon. Doesn't necessarily reference Satan in the story of Saint George, but a lot of different cultures have described these creatures. From when you're doing your research, is there differences in any of the research that you found that dragons are in the different cultures?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Oh, first and foremost, dragons are found all over the world, in writings. Obviously, there's been no bones or skeletons that have been found for dragons. Not saying they haven't really existed at some point, but as far as we know today, they're just mythological stories. However, when you look through the cultures, and I'm talking about India, China, Europe, the Americas, the way the dragon looks and the way it acts and reacts is completely different throughout each culture. Dragons in Chinese, and you could correct me if I'm wrong here, but they're usually associated as good luck and a protector of the people there. And often they have this, just by look, they have this weird serpent-like, shape to them, body-wise. They're very elongated. They have, their heads are constantly different. We see that some of them with horns, we see some of them with these tentacle-type things on their head, stuff like that. And there's, depending on the story, sometimes they don't breathe fire or anything like that. Other times they do breathe fire. Sometimes they spew water. Sometimes they're considered a water dragon or a fire dragon or earth dragon.
Right.
Depending on where you're at. Same thing goes along with India and Europe. It's very interesting because Europe and the Americas are probably the two places in which dragons have been considered more of an evil thing as opposed to a representation of good. In particular, Europe in the medieval times really had this fear of dragons, especially when related to the scriptures, because Christianity was so strong back then and had a powerful impact on the people of the medieval times, in which the scripture told us that, and still tells us, that Satan is represented as a dragon, or a dragon represents Satan. So there's this unique evil to the dragon, and so when the medieval times came around, people were really outstretched for what was good and what was bad, and it was usually like people see in the stories. You think of the stories of King Arthur, and the Knights of the Round Table and stuff. Dragons have pretty much always been a bad thing, minus one or two versions of the dragon in the stories, But we always see people with giant shields trying to slay the dragon. So dragons are considered an evil thing. They would come in, according to the story, and just burn down entire cities and villages and whatnot. In the Americas, and this goes along with the European ones too, the shape of the dragon changes quite a bit. We no longer have the serpent style, but we have more of a giant lizard, or some would represent, equal it to a dinosaur of some sort, whether that be kind of like a T-Rex, only larger arms. Some will see them as just two-legged. Some will consider them four-legged, which is the ones that I personally know best, probably, in regards to European and American folklore. And they have wings, where like Chinese dragons typically don't have wings. They just fly based on their magical abilities. Right. American and European dragons actually have wings to fly, so it kind of gives you this bird-like or bat-like feel to it. But America is pretty much the big melting pot of it all, so we kind of get a little bit of everything, no matter what continent the story comes from. They kind of all circulate the Americas.
Well, one thing that I think this is the biggest difference between the East and the West. The West dragons are considered benevolent, almost godlike creatures. They lay dormant in the winter in the water, rivers, lakes, and then in the spring and summer months they go into the sky, and it is believed that the thunder and lightning is from battling opposing dragons. I can't remember for the life of me what the rain is considered, which I'm not even sure if I want to know. But because if it's from dragons, it could be their spit, it could be other bodily fluids that I don't even want to consider. Anyway, but that's one of the biggest things too, is Eastern, which is Europe and the Americas. As far as I know, we're not considered gods, except for maybe the Native Americans might have considered dragons gods. But I don't really know a whole lot of native folklore about dragons in particular. I just know a lot of the Chinese and the European folklore. But yeah, there's several different I don't know what you would call them, classifications, I guess, because there are, the Chinese dragons. When you get into medieval folklore, there's several types of, I guess, classifications. You would call it, is because you got the dragons with, as you said, the four legs with the wings. I believe the wyvern, which is the ones without the four legs, just the two legs and wings. You've got the worm, which is kind of like the Western dragon, where it's just serpent-like. Yeah, serpent-like. And you also have the Chimera, which is from Greek lore, which has, well, depending on the lore that you find, sometimes it's got 3 heads, lion, goat, and dragon head, with that of a body of a lion, and then the tail is a snake. Sometimes it's the head of a lion, the body of a goat, and the tail of a dragon, or a snake, depending, again, on the lore. So it kind of really varies for the Chimera, but the wyvern, like I said, the worm and the regular dragon are the 3 classifications most known in medieval culture. Mm-hmm. So it's hard to say like how this lore got started. Nowhere does it point to anything specific as far as, like, obviously when Christianity came around, there was the mention of the dragon in the Bible. But prior to that, there's no rhyme or reason as to where the European dragons came from. Like I said, the Chinese believe them to be gods, so you could see where they came from there. But I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? Like where it originated?
Well, if I had to guess, I didn't do any of the research to find out exactly where it originated. It is kind of difficult to come to that conclusion. But if I had to guess, I would say it probably originated in the Asia area. Probably China, most likely. I think that would be the most logical sense. That's where it began. And then it moved east. And it just so happened that, we've talked about this before on other episodes of the show, in which this whole, idea behind folklore, legends and myths and so on and so forth, playing telephone. So as the myth goes on to different people, it slightly changes over the course of, months, years, et cetera, et cetera. So, eventually by the time it got to Europe, there's a very good possibility that it changed so much that, we have these completely different looking creatures. They're evil, so on and so forth. One place in particular, if I'm not mistaken, is the Irish have their own legends about the dragon as well.
Right.
And of course, there's a whole bunch of different myths regarding like what the dragons do. Because I know, as you said, in China they're considered gods. In ancient Europe they're considered evil. But there's the ones that are considered protectors of valuables.
Right.
And assets. They protect gold and all kinds of riches and stuff like that. So it really depends. But to answer your question, in a very long, stretched out manner, I think it's very possible or probable that it started or originated in China and then just moved its way to the east.
Well, the one thing that you had mentioned was like King Arthur. I mean, his name was Arthur Pendragon. In that era, the dragons were revered more so as I don't know if you would call them good, but in that day and age, supposedly people had pet dragons, and a lot of people used them in their family crests, such as Arthur's lore. Because just like the dragons, folks, King Arthur has never been proven to ever been really an existing character in history. That's where a lot of it gets kind of iffy, is because there have been tales of good dragons, bad dragons, godlike dragons in China. One thing that I did forget to bring up was in the story of St. George. This one might be a reference to some type of demon or satanic thing that was going on, because he slayed the dragon, and the dragon was demanding human sacrifice once a year, a virgin maiden every year, and it finally came down to George's daughter, and he vowed to kill this dragon and ended up killing the dragon. So I'm not sure, like, where that story actually goes as far as what the dragon was. Was it what we know today as a dragon? Was it something more demonic, or Satan himself playing a role here? But that's when we start getting into the Christianity side of it, because St. George, even though saints aren't in the Bible, we're not supposed to worship saints or ask for their help or anything like that. But I'm not sure where that particular lore came from, other than it was a dragon. So,
right.
And as Eric said too, there is lore of these creatures breathing fire, breathing ice, multiple elements. Again, if we were to think of a dragon nowadays, as far as chemically, the only thing that they would probably be able to breathe is fire. But then again, I don't know of any creature that breathes fire. So I'm not sure there.
No, I mean, I'm trying to think as if there really is something, but you never know. Not necessarily breathe fire, but when you look at the type of animals that do exist, you can kind of get an idea as to how these dragons have formed. When you look at the horned lizard, for example, it shoots blood out of its eye.
Oh, okay.
As a defense mechanism. Then you also have snakes, for example, and rather large snakes, especially when you think of anacondas, for example, or boas. They're huge, and so one can kind of not mistake, but alter the details a little bit about these creatures. And the one thing I was thinking about, actually, just as we were talking, or you were talking, was how did. Not necessarily where did it originate, but how did it come to be? How did these stories come up? Because as you and I discussed, we think that a lot of these legends come from some sort of truth somewhere down the line. Right. There's something truthful about it somewhere. And the only thing I can think of is maybe, and this is, bear with me, maybe there was a tornado or a water spout, and it picked up a snake, and the snake fell from the sky. Boom, dragons fly. It was a god falling after he got killed during a thunderstorm. Yeah, it makes sense, right? Yeah. But going back to the whole fire thing, obviously, as far as I know, there's no creature that spews fire from its mouth. But there are creatures such as snakes or Komodo dragons that use a venom or a very toxic saliva to help kill its victims, which can almost be similar to that of fire, especially with some of these venoms burning really badly and the type of death that people receive from it. So, I mean, there's the possibility as to why we come up with fire.
Yeah, that could.
Then again, dragons are considered to be, I guess, they've been around since creation, basically. And in some legends, I'm sure they're even considered creators themselves of the universe. But with saying that, a lot of the elements that we have on our Earth are considered originators: rock, water, fire, wind, and so you start seeing a lot of these associated with the dragons. You see earth dragons, you see fire-breathing dragons, you see dragons that live in the water, and we see dragons that live in the sky. And of course, that goes along with the whole Western culture as well, in which elements really play a huge role into their belief systems.
Right.
So it would only make sense that these views of the dragon would not indicate, but would include them breathing fire or something like that.
Right. Well, one thing that has crossed my mind numerous times, and I didn't see anything in any research that I've ever done that would validate this, but one thing that I've always thought of was think of I shouldn't say early man, but earlier civilizations coming across dinosaur fossils, not being able to explain what this thing is that they're seeing, their mind starting to form a scenario, if you will, because they're scared. As you and I have said numerous times, fear plays a huge factor. So they come back and tell this tale and just give this thing a name and call it a dragon. So their explanation of what they saw and what they, supposedly fought, because they're afraid of whatever it is they've found. And that's where the dragon is first brought up. There's been a couple of cases that I found where they found a dinosaur fossil or a huge bear bone and called it a dragon bone or skull. And there have even been cases nowadays where people have made these little baby dragons in jars about this big out of whatever, and it can be faked too.
Right.
So, not really sure. Like, that's the best explanation I can come up with, since we have not found bones, even though these creatures are supposedly supposed to be immortal or very long-lived. That where these things have come from. All right, folks. So we have kind of figured out where the origin of the dragon comes from. So we're gonna go to our quick break here, and when we come back, I think we'll touch base on the dragon in the Bible. It's described a couple of times, but first, here's Eric's random fact of the day.
Now, Eric's random fact of the day.
Have you ever wondered why the look of a scar never changes? According to FactSlides.com, scars continue to look the same year after year. Because while skin cells are replaced periodically, the underlying collagen is not.
This was Eric's random fact of the day.
It's a day that ends in Y, so it's time to listen to Wisecrackin' with Winter. Hi, I'm your host, Mike Winter, Minnesota's #1 self-acclaimed comedy podcast. I have on a variety of guests: paranormal investigators, lawyers, political pundits, softcore porn writers and producers, my dad, stand-up comedians, and did I mention my dad? Give me a listen on iTunes, Google Play, or my website, getwisecrackin.com. Thanks for taking the time to listen, and you stay classy out there.
All right, folks, welcome back to Paratruth Radio right here on the Paratruth Radio Network. My name is Justin.
I'm Eric.
And we've kind of given base as to where we think the dragon lore kind of came from. But Eric, I did want to hand it over to you to tell us a little bit about where the Bible shows up, or where the dragon shows up in the Bible.
The dragon shows up numerous times throughout Scripture. Sometimes the dragon is considered a creature of some sort. Other times, and more often, it's considered Satan, or references Satan in some way. But the one thing I want to mention real quick before we get into a couple of the mentions of dragons in the Scripture is the origin of the word dragon, which is really interesting because the word dragon comes from the original Greek word drakon, which means serpent. But then later in Old French and to Middle English became known as dragon. And so the word serpent, though, is really interesting to me because, as we know, serpents are typically known as snakes nowadays. That's usually what we consider them. And so right off the bat, in the very first book of the Holy Bible, Genesis chapter 3, we learn about a serpent that comes up to Eve and tries to tempt her into taking a fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, in which God strictly told her and Adam, do not eat from. They couldn't eat from that, and they couldn't eat from the tree of life. And if they did, he told them that they would surely die. Now, back in Genesis, the serpent was very crafty, and he told Eve that she surely wouldn't die from eating the fruit. and she believed him. So she took the fruit, she ate it, and then she gave it to Adam, and he ate it. And sure enough, they suddenly had knowledge of both good and evil, but God became very angry with them, and they were cursed to die. And it's really interesting here because a lot of people think that the dragon straight up lied, or the serpent, which is Satan, by the way, straight up lied to Eve and said, "You're not going to die." But in reality, he just twisted words, which is really interesting because I think a lot of people don't realize that, yes, Satan lies, but most of the time he tells the truth just in a very subtle and reversed way, than what most people would understand.
Right. And, in that story, we're led to understand and believe that the serpent or snake had legs in that, which in a sense would be a dragon, as we were talking about earlier.
Right. And
it's funny that it had legs because God says, now you are cursed to slither on your belly for eternity. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of interesting that reference, it could be a dragon, and then it loses its legs, which would be the equivalent of a worm, which was, as we talked about earlier, a dragon classification. So
right. And that right there, you're referencing Genesis chapter 3, verse 14, in which God does say, "Cursed are you above all livestock and all the wild animals. You will crawl on your belly and you will eat dust for the rest of your life." But what's really interesting about this entire thing, now that you brought that up, is that just this past summer, scientists, and I believe I saw this on National Geographic or something like that, scientists found a skeleton of a snake with legs. Which is really interesting because for the longest time, scientists claimed that snakes never had legs and couldn't have had legs. It just didn't make sense. But all of a sudden, here we have this fact. We have a full evidence of a snake that has 4 legs. It is a very old fossil. And of course, scientists, now mind you, a lot of creationists or Christians believe that evolution doesn't exist. Not full-blown evolution such as Darwin talks about.
Like we're monkeys.
Right. Humans were never monkeys. Some people, maybe. They're just, No. But seriously, though, people were never animals, even though we are considered creatures of some sort. But we were never monkeys. There was no evolution. And you can look through all the evidence you want. You'll never find like a skeleton in between the evolution process, that's half monkey, half human. It just doesn't exist. Right. There's monkeys, gorillas,
I've seen numerous people say on Facebook, if evolution was real, why do we still have monkeys?
Exactly. But so it's interesting because, like, when I saw this, that the snake had legs in the past, suddenly it just solidified my belief in the scriptures and my belief in God, because God mentioned it at the very beginning of the scripture in chapter 3. He tells the snake he's losing his legs. But scientists come through real quick, and of course they're going to throw that right out. Like, oh, no, this creationist stuff is just crap. In reality, it's evolution. And somewhere down the line, the snake realized it no longer needed the legs, and it just started to crawl on its belly. But of course, and I think anyone out there who, agree to disagree, whatever, but it doesn't make any logical sense that any creature would just decide to lose its legs or evolve. I mean, it's not called evolution. You're losing a lot of that really would help you. Normally, being on your legs would protect the belly. Well, it would allow them to hold things, et cetera, et cetera.
Look at lizards when they lose, not necessarily limbs, but if they lose their tail, it starts to grow back. If they lose a limb, it grows back, but the claw and stuff doesn't usually grow back. So you would think if it lost its limb and evolution were true, don't you think the lizard would be like, oh, look, I don't need my limbs. I don't need to grow them back.
I mean, it just doesn't make sense because based on evolution, from what I've seen, based on Darwin's, beliefs and experiments and whatever, his theory, we should basically be evolving to become better, stronger, adapting. Snakes, on the other hand, if they had legs once, went in the reverse way, They went a back step. But in reality, you would think, hey, if that's true, well, then the snake had no legs, now has legs, then decided it's going to become a Komodo dragon, then a crocodile, then a saltwater crocodile, et cetera, getting bigger, stronger, so on and so forth. It just doesn't happen. It's not there, And of course, there's this argument, well, the snake is a completely different creature. No, you can't have that argument there. It just doesn't make sense. So here, I think it's very straightforward that snakes once had legs, and God basically cut them off, in a sense, because of the evil that Satan had done. Now, getting back into the scripture about dragons, that was the very first time that the serpent came up and can be considered a dragon in a sense. However, in my opinion, one of the most, informational views of the dragon comes in the book of Job, chapter 41. Now, at this point in chapter 41, Job had gone through a lot between chapter 1 and 41. He's lost pretty much all of his family. He's lost livestock. He's lost a lot of his sanity at this point, probably. He's been cursed with all kinds of boils and pain and illness and whatnot. And he decides finally to look up to God and argue with him as to why this was happening. And of course, if I've learned anything over the past week of my studies, you can't argue with God. God knows everything. You just cannot argue with God, period. But in the argument, God eventually brings up the story, if you will, of the Leviathan. He mentions Leviathan. And Leviathan is probably one of the most common names out there for an ancient dragon, which people, I think, could easily reference. I'm going to go ahead and just read it real quick. It's pretty short. And this is God talking. He says to Job, "I will not fail to speak of Leviathan's limbs, its strength, and its graceful form. Who can strip off its outer coat? Who can penetrate its double coat of armor? Who dares open the doors of its mouth, ringed about with fearsome teeth? Its back has rows of shields, tightly sealed together. Each is so close to the next that no air can pass between. They are joined fast to one another. They cling together and cannot be parted. Its snorting throws out flashes of light. Its eyes are like the rays of dawn. Flames stream from its mouth. Sparks of fire shoot out. Smoke pours from its nostrils as from a boiling pot over burning reeds. Its breath sets coals ablaze, and flames dart from its mouth." That right there is very typical description, more or less, of a dragon, right? I mean, it sounds like a dragon. The one thing that's interesting as well, because we've talked about, water dragons, sky dragons, land dragons, so on and so forth. The one thing that's interesting about this passage, which I didn't read, but it actually comes a little bit before this passage, by the way, about the Leviathan is very descriptive, and it's very long in the book of Job. So it's really interesting if you ever want to check it out. But it talks about this Leviathan being in the water. It lives in the sea. And that's very interesting to me because here, this creature lives in the sea, but it breathes fire. And these are two elements that just don't mix.
Right.
You simply cannot do it without another element added in, such as oil or something like that, right? Or some kind of benefactor. But what this shows us is just how powerful and creative God is. He's so creative and so powerful that he's able to take two elements that logically cannot mix, but yet become logical and suddenly are capable of mixing and not interfering with the one or the other. The properties stay the same. Fire and water live together in this sense. It's really cool to me just to show or learn the power of God through this and what he can do. Now, whether or not this Leviathan is a literal creature that God was talking about, I don't know. Maybe it was just a figurative, story that God told. Maybe something that was passed down through the Israelites back then, and through the Jews. I don't know. I like to think and truly believe that it was one time a real creature that existed in the seas. Why do we no longer see them? I can't tell you. I don't know. But it's definitely very interesting. And by far, probably the most descriptive story about dragons within the scripture. However, dragons are also talked about in the book of Revelation. And this is when we start getting into the aspect, and of course we've been in this aspect a little beforehand as well throughout the scriptures, different books of the Bible, but Book of Revelation is really descriptive here, in which Satan is represented by a dragon. In Revelation chapter 12, it's titled "The Woman and the Dragon." The dragon appears as a sign in heaven. And so just that on its own, you kind of question, well, obviously this isn't a real dragon, but it's just a representation, because otherwise it wouldn't say that another sign appeared in heaven. But it says, then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on its head. Its tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth, so that it might devour her child the moment he was born. This is really interesting, because these are, just this passage alone, the entire chapter 12 is pretty much seems to be a fourth knowledge, because that, what I just read, is actually a pretty good description of what happened with the birth of Christ. There was a virgin woman who was about to give birth to a son, and it just so happened that when Mary was about to give birth to Jesus, King Herod had his men go out and slaughter all of the babies born, all the male babies born within those first 2 years. Well, it just so happens that Mary and Joseph moved away, had Jesus, and then came back, and so Jesus got away from the killing there. But that's where it says, the dragon stood in front of the woman about to give birth, so that it might devour her child the moment it was born. The word devour there, I think personally, is a representation of when, the armies went out to just kill all the firstborn male, or the male born males, male children born in hopes of getting rid of Jesus. But that in itself is strictly a representation of Satan, because in verse 9 it says the great dragon was hurled down from heaven, that ancient serpent called the devil, or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. Right there is when we learn that the serpent back in Genesis 1 was Satan. So that's one interesting revelation of a dragon there. The next one is the beast out of the sea, which can go along with the whole chimera type thing, or chimera,
right? I believe is how it's pronounced.
Yeah. So the whole chimera thing, and so in Revelation chapter 13 it says the dragon stood on the shore of the sea, that's Satan, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 crowns on its horns, and on each head a blasphemous name. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but had feet like those of a bear, and a mouth like that of a lion. The dragon gave the beast his power, and his throne and great authority. Obviously, there's another interesting, description of a dragon of some sort. The final one that I'm just going to talk about is the beast of the earth. Again, this is another type of dragon. It says, and you'll see why in a moment, but it says, then I saw a second beast coming out of the earth. It had 2 horns like a lamb, but it spoke like a dragon. And it exercised all authority of the first beast on its behalf. Now, this one obviously doesn't go into nearly as much explanation or description of what it looks like. It just simply says it has 2 horns like a lamb and spoke like a dragon. What does that mean? Basically, this is the false prophet. And the false prophet looks harmless, hence looks like a lamb, has 2 horns like a lamb, but speaks like a dragon, extremely powerful, able to turn people, and stop them, and so on and so forth. So it's really interesting that these 3 descriptions of these 3 very evil beings happen to be represented by a dragon. And of course, a lot of this isn't literal. It doesn't mean that they are dragons, but they're parables, if you will, of what they really are, and some of this could be represented as countries. Some people believe that the fact that the second beast resembled a leopard but had feet of those of a bear and a mouth like that of a lion is actually a representation of 3 different countries or 3 different nations. And of course that there's a whole lot more theology there that I'm not going to get into because this is about dragons today. But that right there, just everything I've talked about within the mentionings of dragons within the Bible are very broad and vast in that it goes everywhere from a little snake, which could have been and most likely was Satan, to a literal creature known as Leviathan, to all of a sudden this representation of Satan and the other two beasts of Revelation, which happen to be represented by dragons. And so dragon is used quite a bit throughout the scriptures. It's very interesting.
So, do you think in lore that we're not talking about a literal creature here, that maybe Satan or demons trying to portray themselves as a dragon were coming up in different cultures to try and persuade them? Like, we know a lot of belief is like Greek culture, that was demons and Satan trying to portray themselves as gods. Do you think that that's what was going on, or do you think the dragon is a literal creature?
See, all right. Now, I guess on occasion I'm kind of stuck in between. Oftentimes it's either one or the other for me. In this case, I'm kind of stuck in between because I really don't know. There's no evidence supporting that it was indeed a literal creature, but there's also no significant evidence pointing towards a fact that it was demons portraying these. Now, I know through different occultic type writings, demons have appeared as dragon-like creatures or serpents or a number of different animals, if you will. So there's nothing saying that it couldn't have been demons influencing these people. But I think it's kind of half and half. I think people designed the dragon based on actual creatures that exist today, right now. Snakes, the Komodo dragon, a number of different lizards, crocodiles, whales, for example. I read an article that said that, maybe the ancient people found whale bones on the shore. And it was so large, and whales back then were so mysterious because they lived deep in the sea, that maybe it was dragons. They didn't know that it came from the sea necessarily. They didn't know where it came from. But I think it's very possible that these people already had this image in place, and then demons came in and started to flip it and use it. Hence the reason perhaps some cultures worship the dragon and consider it a god, because God is not considered a dragon. Jesus is not considered a dragon, only Satan is. So it's very possible, and of course we know that Satan is going to do everything in his power to lure us away from God. And if that's worshiping this mighty creature, serpent, which, weird coincidence here, then that's what it's going to be, Yeah. Worship this dragon being instead of God.
Well, I would, just because I love dragons, I would wish that they were real creatures, but we haven't seen anything that would point to that they are, that it was just people trying to explain something that they found. One thing that I had actually come across before I had decided to have us do this topic was we had talked about dragons with Linda Godfrey and how these people had claimed that they had seen these winged lizard creatures, and had talked about how they were possibly interdimensional creatures, which a lot of people believe, that it's all demons because they're coming through our plane of existence and just forming whatever form they want. But a lot of creatures that we have talked about could possibly be interdimensional type creatures that are just coming through the veil. But yeah, I'm kind of up in the air on it. I don't really know what they were or what they are. But that's the best we can all come up with. Really, there's no evidence pointing to dragons are real. So I mean, of course, there's no evidence pointing to say the Loch Ness Monster is real, but I still believe that the Loch Ness Monster is real just because of creatures like Leviathan that show up in the Bible and other lore. So I think it's a possibility, but at the same time, it's a possibility that it was just people trying to describe what they were finding or what they were seeing.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. All right, folks, we are about to take our second break. Of course, we are talking about dragons, and it's an awesome discussion about dragons. It's one of Justin's favorite topics. Now, I know he loves werewolves, but werewolves is really kind of my thing, where dragons is really his thing. Yeah. You know, we do have a separation. It's weird. Don't tell anybody that. Well, don't tell him that I told you this. But usually, in the past, I don't know what it is like now. I'm sure it's worse.
I'm right here.
But did you guys hear something? No, I didn't. I wasn't sure. I think it was my cat. His room has a crap load of dragons in it. A bunch of statues, pictures, all kinds of ridiculous things. He has T-shirts with dragons on it.
Yeah.
This dude's clinically insane. We don't even know if they exist, and he wears T-shirts. I mean, it's
I also have a tattoo of a dragon.
Oh, look, there's a tattoo. You know what? That's all right. We're still brothers. Dragons.
And there's the difference, too. You have the Chinese, and I have the medieval.
The medieval. What do you know? Anyhow, oh, by the way, for any of you who aren't watching the YouTube channel, we just both showed our tattoos of dragons that we have. If you didn't understand what was going on there.
Yeah.
Anyway, like I said 10 minutes ago, we're going to break. So we will be back real soon to discuss a little bit more about the dragons. But before we do that, we need to take just a personal stop on the side of the road so we can listen to Justin's paranormal headlines. We'll be right back. And now, Paratruth Radio's paranormal headlines.
How's it going, Parafans? Justin here with your paranormal headlines. And this headline is from USADailyPolitics.com. Snowden claims Osama bin Laden is still alive. Former CIA employee Edward Snowden has said that he has evidence showing that Osama bin Laden, who was supposedly killed in Pakistan in 2011 by U.S. Special Forces, is still alive and well. In an interview with the Moscow Tribune, Snowden said Osama was living in the Bahamas on the payroll of the CIA. He told the newspaper, "I have documents showing that bin Laden is still on the CIA's payroll. He is still receiving more than $100,000 a month, which is being transferred through some front businesses and organizations directly to his Nassau bank account. I am not certain where he is now, but in 2013 he was living quietly in his villa with 5 of his wives and many children." Snowden, who now lives as a fugitive in Russia, fled the U.S. after leaking documents about the NSA's mass surveillance programs to the media in 2013. The report also said that Snowden previously too made some unreported allegations about Osama bin Laden. Snowden goes on to say that the CIA orchestrated the fake death of the former leader of the Al-Qaeda. He claims that Osama was transported with his family to an undisclosed location in the Bahamas. The report further quotes him as follows: Osama bin Laden was one of the CIA's most efficient operatives for a long time. What kind of message would it send their other operatives if they were to let the SEALs kill him? They organized his fake death with the collaboration of the Pakistani secret services, and he simply abandoned his cover. Since everyone believes he is dead, nobody's looking for him, so it was pretty easy to disappear. Without the beard and the military jacket, nobody recognizes him. Not only this, Snowden categorically states that he will talk about the documents which prove bin Laden is alive in his soon-to-be-released book. However, Snowden's claims have not been substantiated or confirmed by any other source. The U.S. government has filed espionage charges against Snowden for revealing classified NSA documents to journalists. And this has been Justin with your paranormal headlines.
This was a segment of Paratruth Radio's paranormal headlines. What's up, folks? Welcome back to Paratruth Radio on the Paratruth Radio Network. My name is Eric.
And I'm Justin.
Hope you're having a wonderful time this evening, as we always do. You know, this has been a fun conversation. Not to say that not every episode is fun, because they are all fun. But this one is particularly fun. Dragons is something we haven't really covered, but a little bit, as you had said with Godfrey, which was a really, interesting topic there in of itself. With her book. But the one thing I did want to bring up before we, take it out to the end of the show here is just how dragons seem to show up nowadays in the multimedia, in our culture. Other than the Chinese, I mean, here in America, we don't really see dragons as these evil creatures that currently live, or godlike creatures that currently exist. We don't see that in Europe. I know it's shown like that in China here and there, depending on who you are and what kind of beliefs you follow.
Right.
But the one thing that I notice most is how the dragons tend to show up, not only in books, but mostly in television and video games these days.
Yeah.
Merlin was a very big show in which a dragon played a significant role. Not as big of a role as most of their stars, but the dragon is personally my favorite of the entire show. And he was kind of considered that evil/good. He kind of lived on the border. But we also see him in a number of different books. Probably one of the most famous books of all time would be the Harry Potter stories.
Aragon as well.
There you go, Aragon. The dragon showed up, and I haven't seen it, but Hobbit. The Smaug one? Something Smaug?
Yeah. Smaug is a dragon. Yeah.
Smaug is a dragon. Okay. So dragons show up a lot, and especially in books. In fact, Justin's book, which he is currently editing, in a way depicts that of a dragon, based on not that it is, but based on the whole chimera idea of what a dragon is. Yeah. So chimera takes. This is interesting about chimeras. You had mentioned that there are dragons called chimeras, but in reality, a chimera can be a number of different things. It doesn't have to be a dragon. It could be, on Teen Wolf, for example, on MTV, a chimera is known as a gigantic werewolf. But it's also known as a mixed breed of lizard of some sort, where it's like, I think it's like a lizard plus a werewolf plus something else that creates this weird creature. The griffin in Justin's story. And we're not going to get into too much of that now, because we are going to have an episode simply based on his book. But his book does tell about a griffin, which can be considered a chimera. And one can consider it even a dragon, especially when you look at some of the photos of dragons in ancient, or not ancient, but in like medieval times.
Some of them are depicted as having feathers and that sort of thing. Yep.
Yeah. So really interesting stuff. The dragon is definitely a fun topic to talk about. Obviously, as far as I know, they don't exist. Never did. Don't know. Doesn't mean they didn't. But I think if they did exist today, and they were anything like our modern movies and television tell us, they'd be a pretty scary thing to have them around.
Well, the one movie that actually kind of depicted dragons being around in modern times was Reign of Fire. And that had Matthew McConaughey in it, and they were taking down helicopters and everything else. So so I could just imagine dragons being around today if they truly existed. Yeah.
Well, folks, with that said, this does lead us to the end of the show. Dragons, very interesting topic. Looking forward to next week's, though. It's always good to look forward, especially when you get to the end of the show, because it's sad, as I say every week for the past 3 weeks now.
But it's the best part of my week, so I'm sure it's the best part of yours, too. It's just a escape, if you will.
Yeah. With that said, though, since we are here on the end of the show, Justin, can you tell us what's coming up next week?
Next week, we're going to talk about the 1111 Enigma. It's been touched on a couple shows. We're going to have our friends Scott and Heidi from Talk Supernatural. They have actually had an 11/11 event happen in their lives numerous times, so that's why I wanted to decide to bring them on, because they do have a little bit of knowledge of this. So looking forward to that. I did want to say thank you to our friends at paranormalforum.net for featuring our show on Tuesday, and looking forward to continuing to have them feature our shows on there as well. I'm trying to think if there's any other news or announcements. Oh, if you didn't catch Tiger Girl for God on Wednesday, make sure you check out that. She is a part of the Paratruth Radio Network. So I think that's all the announcements I've got. Do you have anything that you need to add?
Nope, pretty much set.
All right. So, folks, thank you once again for always listening to Paratruth Radio. As always, if you guys have any questions, ideas for new guests, ideas for a show that you want to start, a podcasting show, I encourage you guys to get a hold of us, paratruthradio@gmail.com. And just pitch us your ideas if you do have a show idea. One thing that I had talked to Bob Bain from the Far Side on the paranormalforum.net was that it's kind of amazing how quickly podcasting has become such a huge thing. He started in 2014, hadn't heard of it prior to that. In 2009, you and I had never heard of the term podcast. We were just like, we should start an online radio show. Well, what is that? It's a podcast. So, and it actually started in 2004. So, really interesting how it all comes really quickly. And, nowadays podcasting has become as somebody had kind of said it, the blog of 2000. So,
it's interesting because, I graduated in 2004, so one can say that I sparked
the podcast.
The podcast thing. I was going to use a different word, but couldn't remember it when I said, I forgot it because I thought of the word, anyway.
So, yeah.
That's the show for this.
Yeah. So, folks, keep tuning in every week, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Sundays. Until next time, where you will find us same time, same channel. My name is Justin.
And I'm Eric. Peace. If you enjoyed this episode of Paratruth Radio, and you would like to listen to it again, or are interested in listening to any of our past episodes, then you can listen to them on HD at our website, paratruthradio.com.
And you can also find us at Stitcher, Blueberry, TuneIn, iTunes, Spreaker, and YouTube.
And of course, like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter for brand new updates of our show every day.